Oh, you have got to be kidding me. Hello fellow CNC nuts and welcome. Well, that's just bloody typical. You're halfway through a cut and all of a sudden the damn thing stops working. Now I've got an even bigger problem. The whole gantry's been moved. How the hell am I going to reset that? Well, fear not. There's a simple way of doing it. Well, quite obviously the power is back on. But you'll notice before that I accidentally leant on my machine and moved it. Not that that really mattered, because when it stopped I had absolutely no idea where it was anyway. But having leant on one side of the gantry, I've pushed it out a square. Now this isn't a problem you'll experience if you have a lead screw machine, but on rack and pinion, when the stepper motors are not powered, they can easily be pushed around. Very handy if you want to move the machine out of the way when it's not turned on. You don't need to restart the machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply lift the machine up out of the way, bring it to the front of the table like so. I'll just put it into emergency stop and pull the gantry towards me until it hits the hard limits. I now know the machine is squared. Just take it out of the e-stop there and just move it out of the way. So that's re-squared my machine. I was very careful not to unbolt the work from the table, so we're good there. Setting Z's never going to be a problem because I know I had the cutter set to the surface of the material, so that's good. What I need to do is figure out now how to do my X and Y. Let's have a wee clean up here and see what we've actually got. Okay, so I've got to reset the cutter back to the material and get my X, Y and Z positions correct. Now before anybody mentions about how well I'd be, or how much better off I would be if I had limit switches, that may or may not be true. I don't know how they react when you have a power outage, but the fact of the matter is I don't have them, so I need to reset this manually. And a lot of the people who watch this channel don't have them either and are stuck with the same dilemma. So the first thing I did when I started this project was I drilled a small hole. When I drew this, I randomly picked a spare spot on my stock that wasn't going to be used in the design and simply drilled a hole there. So this is the completed drawing, and I've already gone through and put my toolpaths on it. This is what it'll look like when it's all cut out. But even though I finished the drawing, there's one last thing I want to do, and that's I want to drill a hole in it. I'm going to pick a spot somewhere around about here on a piece of waste material, and I'm just going to position it a little bit more accurately than it currently is. I'll make it 7mm in the X and 51mm on the Y. And I'll now create a toolpath for it. This one I'm simply going to drill. I'm just going to call it drill number 1. I'm going to use a 6mm end mill, and I'm going to drill it to a depth of 10mm. We'll just quickly preview that. We'll actually move it up, so it's actually the first toolpath that's going to be actioned. And there's our hole. You can see it's in the stock, but it isn't going to be cut at all by any of these toolpaths, so it won't be affected. And this is going to make an excellent reference hole should anything happen when I'm cutting. If you remember to add one of these to every drawing and make it the first toolpath you cut, then you'll always be able to set your X and Y position without any problem at all. In fact, when I did this, I had to put a 6mm cutter into my spindle specifically to drill this hole. Unfortunately, the rest of it was cut with a down, or the next cut was done with a down cutting spiral bit, and as I've mentioned before, don't go drilling holes with down cutting spiral bits. They're the quickest way to start a fire on a CNC machine. So I had to do one additional toolpath, but if the first cut you were doing was using an upcutting bit, then that would be ideal for drilling your hole. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this cutter here with the drill that drilled the original hole. If this had been a 6mm router bit, I would have been okay, but unfortunately this is not. It's a 5.6mm router bit, so I need to put in my original 6mm cutter. Now I can take this here over to the hole and start working the cutter into that hole there. Now you might find that it's actually very difficult to position it here because the movements are so coarse. You can set the machine to single step where each, in my case I'm using my pendant here, and each step, it now moves just a single step. You can see here I'm using Jerry's 2017 screen set for CNC, and you have that single step and continuous. The standard screen set in CNC has that, as does Mach 3. If you hit the tab key, it'll pull out a pendant and you'll be able to see continuous and single step as well. Once it looks like it's in the correct location, and you can set your single step up coarse or fine. I've got mine set very, very fine indeed, about 1/100th of a millimeter per step when it's doing single step. I'm just going to put it back into continuous. It's not quite right there. I can see it's just touching there, so I'll put it back into single step. And now I can move it across, maybe up a little bit. Let's move it down a bit more. That's pretty good. That's turning freely. I think that's about right. So now that I've got my cutter sitting in the hole, all I have to do is enter here the actual coordinates of that hole, which in my case is 51mm by 7mm. If you're not 100% sure where the reference circle is, simply select it and then come over here to draw circle. Here you can see that the position of the circle is at X 7mm by Y 51mm. Now the same applies if you're using a reference circle that is part of the design. With our X and Y position correct, we can now lift the cutter out. I'm going to put back in the original bull's nose cutter we were using when disaster struck. This cutter was set down to the surface of the material, so I'll just manually reset it. Now the cutter's sitting on the surface of the material, we'll just zero that. And now we should be back in our original location. It would be a good opportunity to reload the file. And here we go, this is what I was cutting. You can see there the hole it drilled, and the first and then the second half circles it had started to machine. So I now need to reset my position, so I'm just going to come down here, and you can see here occasionally there's a white line showing up there. That'll be the roughing cut. There's the fine machining of the first one. And here we go, this is the next profile, which was the fine machining of the second piece here. So I'm just going to run from here. So there it is, it's going to be line 307. I'm just going to click run from here, and we should be away and laughing. I'm going to now go cycle start, and it brings up this screen. It tells me it's going to switch the spindle on at cycle start. It's going to first move the cutter to a safe height of 25 millimeters. It's going to move me to this particular location. In this particular instance, it's actually going to take me to a negative height, but we'll live with that. And so all I have to do is go OK. We can now push cycle start again, and it will continue on its merry way. Well, that's come out pretty good, exactly where it should have been. Well, that's come out exactly right. So as you can see, it's perfectly possible to recover your X and Y position if you drill a small recovery reference hole in your workpiece before you start. And I recommend you do that for every project. Of course, if the project does have holes in it, then drill those holes first, and you've automatically got your recovery position sorted. Now what happens if you've made your file, you brought it out to the workshop, and now you're about to start cutting, you've set your X and Y 0, and you realise, damn, I forgot to do that recovery reference hole. Not a problem. Simply jog the machine to somewhere on the stock that's out of the way, and simply drill a hole there at that location. Grab a pencil and mark down the X and Y coordinates by using the information shown on the screen of Mach 3 or UC CNC. That way, should you need to come back, you simply need to basically do what I did. You'll have those coordinates written down as to the exact location of that hole. After that, it's all plain sailing. Now we come to the more problematic one. What happens if you didn't pre-plan ahead? Well, here's a case in point. No doubt you remember the Aztec calendar. I had a subscriber who was cutting this out, and about 3 hours into the cut, their machine screwed up. It stopped working for whatever reason. I'm not sure why, but the problem was they'd lost position. How do you recover your position on something as complex as this? Well, in this particular instance, it was pretty easy. So by now, we're all familiar with the Aztec calendar. Let's just zoom in here on the center, and we can see a pair of eyes. Now in this particular instance, at least one of the eyes had been machined, and if we look at this pupil in the eye, and come down to the right hand side, we see its width and height are actually the same. That implies that this is actually a circle. If we come over here to draw circle and click on that, it brings up the current X and Y coordinates for the center of our circle. Same applies if we hover our cursor over the center point of the eye. Now this eye is only about 1.6 millimeters, or approximately 1/16 of an inch in diameter. It's a relatively simple process to move the V cutter directly into the center of the eye and then enter the new X and Y coordinates. But how do we get on if you don't even have that to work with? Come on, twice in one day, nobody's going to believe that. So when the power went off, again, I wound the bit manually out of the cut here, and now let's see if we can figure out where it belongs. I've got no reference hole to reset it. So what I do know is that the origin point is here in the center of this material. So my options are, I could just draw some crossed lines and set the cutter back to that. And the best option for doing that would be to use a V-bit. The next option is to try and get the cutter into these two slots here. One of these will give me a Y axis measurement, and the slot will give me a X axis measurement. So I know this here is 50 millimeters that way, and 50 millimeters that way. I know that my cutter is 6.35 millimeters, which means the center of this here will be my half of that distance here from there, so that'll be 25 millimeters from the center to there, and plus my 3.175, and I'll just grab a quick calculator out here because I really can't be bothered working this out in my head. That means that in the center there is 28.175. So if I can get my cutter lined up exactly in this slot here, in the X direction, that'll be 28.175, and in this direction here, along this here, is also 28.175. This one here will be minus 28.175, and this one here also will be minus 28.175. So it's a matter of looking at your drawing and working out exactly where these slots are, and ideally you're looking, well, you need to look for slots that are running perpendicular or with the X and Y axes. If they're on an angle, you can't use those to try and figure out where you are. So let's see if I can get this lined up. My other hope is at the moment that when this stopped, that it actually was in either one or other of them. It looks like it stopped on the corner, or it's come slightly around the corner, so I think the cutter is probably pretty much in alignment with this one here at the moment. Remember, when you're doing this, take it nice and slowly. One false move, you could damage your cutter. So that's looking pretty good so far, and I have to say it's definitely on this side of the cut. It's gone in here and partly around the corner, so I'm going to continue the cutter around this corner here, like so. And it looks like I'm merely touching, no, I'm touching both sides. That's all right, perfect. So I now know where this here is. That's 28.175. Now it's important to remember that this here is the Y position here, so you've got your that's Y, and that there is your X. So this position here, 28.175, is the Y axis coordinate. So I can now enter the corrected coordinate here of 28.175. Notice where the dot currently sits here, and when I hit the enter key, it now takes the dot down onto the drawing here. Now in actual fact the cutter's sitting somewhere around about here, so my X coordinate is nowhere near right either, but we'll look at that now. I can now lift the cutter up out of the slot, and I'm going to bring it across and just down into this slot here. Now it's a matter of carefully working my way to where I can see what's going on. Now the best way of doing that again is using a light to see better. And one of the beauties is you can turn these cutters sideways, which makes them narrower. I can let it drop into the hole, and so long as I'm not wildly off, and I can see here that I'm touching that side, not touching this side here. So the cutter needs to come this way a little bit. I'll just put it into single step mode, and I can start single stepping it. And as I do that, I will just slowly turn the cutter, and as I do that it becomes easier and easier to turn. There we go. Now I'm just going to move that down. I'll just take it out of single step mode and drop that down a little deeper down into the slot. I appear to be touching again, but I seem to be touching evenly on both sides, so I'm pretty happy with that particular location there as well. Last but not least, I need to set the Z height of the cutter, and I'm just going to do that off the table, which is where it was zeroed to before. You're all familiar by now with how to set the cutter to the table surface. And of course you'll just reset it using whatever method you used before. Well, if I've got this right, I should now be able to cut around the square without it taking out more material. Well, that seemed to go pretty well. I could hear a little bit more machining on one side than the other when it was recutting the original paths, but looking at the finished result here, the size is correct and I'm not seeing any ridges on it, so that sort of says to me that I was pretty close, and that's better than I deserve, having no reference point at all with which to reset the cutter. Now, what happens if you're doing a 3D model? You've got no such rigid lines like that, except for perhaps maybe the outside of the cut, and I think I'd calculate what the edges of those were and try and work out where it belonged. But my advice is drill a hole to start with, just do it manually if you have to, but get some sort of a reference there. Finally, there's one other option which I can't show you because I don't have it, but I will put a link to it on my website where you can go and view it. It's the triple edge finder from themakersguide.com. Bill Griggs makes this excellent product which will allow you to set your X, Y and Z position, and it will be repeatable. So if you do suffer such a catastrophe, it's really just a matter of putting the triple edge finder back onto the stock, re-zeroing everything and continuing on from where you left off, or just simply restarting depending on the sort of job you're doing. It is probably one of the better ways of relocating your position. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I don't have homing or limit switches on my machine, so I don't know how they work. I'm not entirely sure they would work properly in a power outage. I know they can be used to reset your position, which is excellent, but I just don't know if the correct offset between machine coordinates and working coordinates are retained if you don't shut your machine down properly. Maybe somebody can put some comments in the comments below, or if you've got a link to a video that demonstrates how limit switches and homing switches can be used to reset your position after a power outage, that would be excellent. I'd like to see that myself. Well, that about wraps it up for this week. I hope you've enjoyed this here, and I hope you find it useful. I hope even more you never actually have to use it, but what are the chances of that? If you're interested in that little piece of wood that I machined up earlier, that's part of an ongoing project that I'm currently videoing, a little series. It's something a little bit different. It's got a little bit of CNC machine work in it. So if you want to see what that's all about, then don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you get notification when that little series starts. Okay, well, all that remains me to do is to thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to check out my channel, www.CNCnutz.com. Have a good weekend, guys, and I'll catch you later. Cheers. You know, I really must pay that power bill.